All right, and it's 1:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you to everybody for joining us here today. My name's Emily, and I'm the Education Coordinator here at Caregivers Nova Scotia. We're a provincial organization supporting family and friend caregivers through navigation of the healthcare system, referrals, caregiver support groups, advocacy, and education, such as these webinars. All of our services are free and support any caregivers in the province. That's not dependent on age or disease or relationship. If you are caring for someone in your life, we are here to help. And we are so thankful to have our webinar today on dignity of risk. It's such an important topic, and we're very grateful to have Catherine Ann Murray and Courtney Cole with us today.
Thank you, Emily. Like Emily said, my name is Courtney Cole. I will be discussing frailty, and then Catherine Ann will continue on with the presentation to discuss dignity of risk in the care of the older adult. So we like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Emily kind of already alluded to this slide, but we are part of the Frailty and Elder Care Network, which is a provincial program with the ultimate goal of enhancing care of the older adult living with frailty. So we kind of have three buckets of work that our goals or visions that we are working towards. Becoming an older adult friendly organization across multiple health domains, so primary health, inpatients, long-term care, community. Adopting a system-wide approach to frailty, how to assess it, manage it, and then also to reduce unintentional hospital harm while in hospital. Today, we're going to go through what is frailty, how to measure it, how can we use frailty to help us care plan and enhance independence, what is dignity of risk, and why can it be challenging to support, exploring a balanced risk management approach to optimize care recipients' sense of self and caregiver coping. So we're going to start the presentation by talking about frailty. So frailty is when an older adult has several interacting health conditions, increasing vulnerability and loss of independence, making daily activities harder. So being old doesn't mean being frail. So that's kind of a myth that if anything you can take away from today, that's a myth we want to bust, is just because you're old or you're aging doesn't mean that you're frail. However, with frailty, with aging, it does increase your risk of developing frailty. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, you can have that understanding of to why. So what does it mean to be living with frailty? So it's more difficult to recover from minor illness and return to baseline function. It increases your risk of poor health outcomes, such as falls, longer time in hospital, and even death. Even with the best care, your body might not be strong enough to fight off a sudden sickness or change in your health. So this is why frailty is so important. So these are some ways to reduce your risk of frailty. Proper exercise, nutrition, sleep, stop smoking if you are smoking, reduce alcohol intake, having a social support or social network and being engaged within your community or your social circles, management of chronic diseases, as well as getting your vaccinations and maintaining those vaccinations, reduced of polypharmacy, falls precautions and preventions, and then also to maintain healthy vision and hearing. These are all ways to reduce your risk of frailty. So the clinical frailty scale is the tool that we use to measure frailty. It was actually developed by a world-renowned geriatrician from Nova Scotia through Dalhousie, Dr. Ken Rockwood. It is a measurement scale that actually defines frailty in different levels, and it's for people or adults 65 years or older. And it looks at an older adult's baseline daily functioning. So how are they thinking, feeling, moving 2 weeks before they became ill? And if they don't have an illness currently, what is their current stable state? So how are they without an illness? So what is their baseline? The biggest thing is when you're saying someone is frail or not frail, it doesn't provide us with a clear enough picture to really know how to help them. It's very subjective. And to be honest, as soon as I hear, oh, that person's frail, I think the worst case scenario. And it really doesn't give me any tangible things of how I can support that person other than thinking of the worst case scenario. So it's really not that useful. For providing care. So driving, making appointments, or financial, like calling your bank or doing any financial tasks, grocery shopping, making your meals, and medication managements. These are all considered instrumentals activities of daily living. So these are functions that we learn later on in life, and we lose these functions first when we're starting to develop mild frailty. So when we're looking at the scale, it's the clinical frailty scale score of 5. These are called your IADLs, those instrumentals activities of daily living. Then we break down into getting dressed, washing or grooming, or bathing, eating, mobility. These are all defined as your activities of daily living. So these are functions that we learn early on in life, and we lose these later on in life once we start to develop, or if we start to develop moderate frailty or more. So on the clinical frailty scale score, which we'll talk about in just a second, that is a 6, living with moderate frailty. The biggest thing is recognizing that when we hear the word frail, we, again, like I said, we seem to think the worst case scenario. So we tend to put our older adults in that severe frailty category before they're even there yet, which actually induces that dependence. So we're going to talk about that a lot in the next couple of minutes. Almost that quote that we hear a lot is killing them with kindness. So we're gonna demyth some of this right now. So this is the clinical frailty scale. It is a 9-point scale. It goes from 1, very fit, all the way up to 9, which is terminally ill. The biggest thing is 1, 2, and 3, you're actually not living with frailty at all. This is aging well. When you're starting to move into a CFS of 4, living with very mild frailty, this is when you are independent of those instrumental daily activities of life, those IADLs, those banking, grocery shopping, transportation, all of those things. And you're still independent with those ADLs, those activities of daily living, but you're starting to slow up in other things. So some activities that you were to have been able to do, you're now not being able to do them as well or as much. An example of this would be mowing your lawn. Maybe you've mowed your lawn your whole life, and now you're starting to find that you're not being able to mow your lawn and you need some support. You're still independent with a lot of other things, but you're starting to slow up. Living with mild frailty, or a CFS of 5, this is when those higher functions, those instrumental activities of daily living is starting to be impacted. So you're starting to need some support with 1 or more of those higher functioning tasks. When living with moderate frailty, or a CFS of 6, this is when those activities of daily living is impacted. So now you need some support with 1 or more of those activities of daily living. When you're moving into that CFS of 7, living with severe frailty, you're now completely dependent for most of your ADLs, so your personal care. But in terms of medically, you're medically still very stable, and you're not at a high risk of dying within the next 6 months, but your world is definitely smaller. Living with very severe frailty, you're now completely dependent of those personal care. You are starting to approach the end of your end of life, and majority of your time is spent in bed. So when you're in this stage, you're typically cannot recover from even the minor illnesses. And then there's an interesting category of the 9s. So 9 is you're in the terminally ill category. You are approaching the end of your life. Your life expectancy is less than 6 months, but otherwise you're not living with any degrees of severe frailty. So the population that would fit into that category would be the people who are diagnosed with a terminal cancer, but otherwise they're very healthy and very active, and their disease process doesn't really impact them until end stages of their life trajectory. So if the person is living with dementia, you can still use the clinical frailty scale to gather the CFS score. The stages of dementia corresponds with the level of frailty. So understanding the stages help us understand when to help and when not to overhelp, and what to help with. For an example, when you hear someone is living with dementia, you may automatically think not safe to be at home by themselves, worry they're going to burn down the house, get lost if they go for a walk. But when you break it down into stages, it reduces that catastrophic thinking. So if someone is living with mild dementia, a CFS of 5, or mild frailty, we now know that they need support with one or more IADLs, those higher functioning tasks, but they're still independent with all their ADLs. So it should alleviate some of that notion that they need someone there all the time and reduce the amount of responsibility to do for. So just to recap quickly, our 1 to 3s are all independent of IADLs and ADLs. These people are not living with any degrees of frailty. This is the definition of aging, healthy aging. Again, the difference is the level of exercise or activity that they do. When we're starting to live with frailty, this is the very mild frailty, 4s, 5s, and 6s. So mild frailty, mild dementia, or moderate frailty, moderate dementia. And again, 4 is still, there's tons of strengths here with people who are living with very mild frailty. They're still independent with all their IADLs and ADLs. They're just starting to slow up. So their world just may look a little bit smaller. They're doing less outside activities potentially. Your level 5, mild frailty, mild dementia, just requires help with those IADLs. But again, they still have a lot of strengths because they're still independent with ADLs. The bathing, the washing, the dressing, the feeding, the mobility, toileting, all of those other functions. Your 6, level 6, or moderate frailty, moderate dementia, they're now having more dependence, and they now need some support with one or more of those ADLs. Again, we're trying to look at, is this a change over time for their function? So is this a new change in ADLs and IADLs over time? So if someone never drove, we're not going to say, oh, well, you need help with transportation, so now you're living with mild frailty. They've never drove before, and that wasn't part of their lifestyle, then we're not going to ding them for not being able to drive now. So again, it's looking at changes over time of what independence they had, and now they're now needing supports with. So 7s to 9s, severe frailty or severe dementia, they now require help with most, if not all, of their ADLs. They're medically stable and are at not a high risk of dying within the next 6 months. Your very severe frailty are people that most of their time is spent in bed, and they are starting to approach end of life within the next 6 months. And now they do need, they're dependent on all their care. And then the terminally ill, CFS of 9, life expectancy less than 6 months. However, not otherwise living with severe frailty. So now that you guys are proficient and you know how to score yourself and your loved one or the person you're providing care for, what now? What do you do with that information? So understanding a person's level of frailty helps identify the actual support they need and avoids that overhelping. It also promotes consistency in care, whether that is through your continuing care coordinator or the people that are coming to your house to provide care through continuing care. If you're going through a private care agency or family support, For an older adult living with moderate frailty, so that would be somebody with a CFS of 6, to support with personal care, it should be tailored to what they actually need help with, such as if they need help with queuing to get dressed or bathing, rather than automatically providing total care. When we have specific plans put in place, we can help the older adult maintain their strengths, independence, and sense of self for longer. Did you know that every day that you're not moving, you lose 2 to 5% of your muscle mass? So it wouldn't take long if someone starts to do 4, it wouldn't take long for that person to lose their strength and ability to do that task or that function. An individualized approach means meeting the older adult where they are rather than making assumptions about what they can do. If an older adult values a particular activity, we should adapt it as much as possible to support participation. While caregiver stress and time pressures are a real thing, and this may not always be possible, breaking activities down into manageable steps can help preserve the person's strength, purpose, and identity. For an example, if someone is living with moderate frailty, a CFS of 6, but enjoys making their own cup of coffee each morning, that activity may become an area of concern. The person can still participate in some steps of the activity, and you may need to provide assistance with pouring the hot water. This approach helps optimize independence despite frailty and changing abilities. Another example is in the bathroom, setting up the environment to support transfers and mobilities can also promote independence. It is often helpful to observe the person complete the activity before stepping in. This can provide reassurance that the task may go more independently than expected and reduce the sense that you always need to be there and be physically present. Supporting the person to do as much as they can helps maintain function confidence for longer. So that is my aspect or my part of the presentation that talks about frailty. But without having a good understanding of frailty, the other part doesn't hit the same way. So I hope, do you guys have any questions before going on to dignity or risk about frailty?
As Courtney was speaking, I'm just reading the chat, and so it's great to see people contribute the CFS score of the person they're caring for, and also themselves. I'm just noticing Therese's comment, which is a very good one. So in dementia, frailty can fluctuate. Some days they can utilize cues, other days not so much. Easier for family to individualize other than services such as home care, as they do not have the consistency. So the abilities within the level of frailty will change day to day, moment to moment. So, for example, if you're living with mild dementia, you have mild frailty, but within that, of course, from day to day, week to week, the abilities are going to depend. And some days that person may need one person assist for managing medications, but other days maybe they just need the queuing. So either way, that's a level of support they're needing. So and yes, it's the family and people closest to that person have the best ability to know and predict and anticipate those changing abilities. And that's why having outside care can sometimes be sometimes stressful, because you have to repeat those details every time a new caregiver comes in and hope that they'll catch on to that routine as well. Frailty can change quickly, right? So that's a good question, Lisa. So it can, but you have to be aware that when someone living with frailty becomes acutely ill, like with an infection, with a fall, and an acute medical event, you can't judge that person by a new level of frailty because of that acute event. So because someone might be living with mild frailty, a CFS of 5, if they have an infection, once the infection is treated or that acute medical event is treated, the aim and hope is to maybe get back to a 5. However, if you live with increased levels of frailty, like 6, 7, 8, and an acute medical event happen, it's less likely the person's going to bounce back to their previous baseline level of frailty. So then their frailty level is more likely to increase from a 6 to a 7 or a 7 to 8. Now, when I was an OT working in geriatrics, certainly I would work with people living in later stages dementia, and the caregivers were doing an exceptional job at providing all the right care and environment for this person. So their level of frailty stayed very stable and the same for a long period of time, even in the 7 and 8 stage. But usually for CFS of 5 and CFS of 6, it can fluctuate between those levels over the period of weeks to months. Okay, so let's dive into dignity of risk. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to add something really quickly, if you're finding they're living with mild frailty, and then all of a sudden you woke up one day and it happened really quick and they're not seeming like their self, and they're like, oh no, this is more, they're living with more frailty now, that's a red flag that something else is going on. So I would seek medical attention if that's the case, because it's most likely it's probably a delirium or something else going on outside of just the frailty level.
Thanks, Courtney. Okay, so the dignity of risk is a topic for anyone who knows me that I can go on and on about, and it brings up a lot of interesting conversations and challenges. So there's always more to talk about, but I'm going to try to use the next 20 minutes to go through the sort of the high level main points and takeaways, and hopefully help caregivers understand how to find that balance between the risk of doing too much for overprotecting our older adults living with dementia or frailty, and juggling that with how do we maintain autonomy, confidence, and sense of self. So typically, if goals of care conversations have been done well and frailty level has been incorporated, major surgery or invasive surgery would probably not be recommended for older adults living with a frailty level of 7 to 8. And there's really good evidence behind the risks of negative outcomes happening if they did have surgery, and the lack of recovery potential for that level of frailty to undergo surgery. So certain goals of care conversation and why the frailty scale score should be included in those goals of care conversation. So thanks for the comment. So quick question for the audience. What are the possible impacts of only viewing risk as negative? Select all that apply. The older adult's independence is minimized. Healthcare staff and caregivers become risk averse or start to fear risk. The older adult experiences improved physical and mental well-being. The individual's choices are controlled or removed. And this is part of the problem in our current healthcare culture working with older adults, and also working with people with disabilities in general, but we tend to view risk as negative and bad. And so our first knee-jerk reaction is to want to prevent older adults from doing things, without exploring a little bit more about what are the real risks and how could we actually look at optimizing their autonomy. So well done. We'll move to the next slide. So the dignity of risk as a concept is understanding that risk is inherent in life. And part of what makes us human as we grow and adapt and learn through life is the freedom to take meaningful risks, but also knowing that there's going to be varying consequences with taking meaningful risks. And that's a part of life. It's a part of being human. It's a part of how we learn and adapt as we grow older. And it doesn't change when older adults, whenever that magic number happens, when we become old. And so it's acknowledging that risk is inherent in life, no matter what stage of life we're in, or no matter what disabilities we may be experiencing. We know that older adults rarely value safety over maintaining autonomy and living life in a meaningful way. So one of the main principles of the dignity of risk is that taking risks have benefits to that older adult. It's usually the caregiver or the healthcare provider that is viewing the risk as bad or negative and to be prevented. Now, typically, older adults living with dementia, later stages dementia or frailty, they either don't have the insight to know what the risks are, and they lack sort of judgment abilities and capabilities, or to them, they're taking the risk because it's just what they've always done, it's meaningful, and they don't see it as a risk. And we want to be able to look for ways to provide better care for older adults experiencing frailty and dementia with this concept in mind, and knowing that the outcomes may always vary in terms of the consequences. Now, this is the tricky part. As a caregiver, caregivers are the ones that usually have to pick up the pieces of the consequences. So then the balance is, how do we support caregivers to know that risk may be possible, but reduce the negative outcome, reduce the risk of negative outcomes coming out from that risk. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yes. Oh, Janine, that's a wonderful comment. Sometimes it's the caregiver's work is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And isn't that the truth? That's one of the hardest things. And you'll see later on, we talk about how to get comfortable with uncertainty. And especially nowadays, we get really uncomfortable with uncertainty when we can have information at our fingertips. So there's always going to be some uncertainty, and sometimes that's the hard part getting used to. So the dignity of risk is not supporting all risk all the time without consideration of others in the older adults context. And I want to make this clear. It's not an excuse for neglectful care. So we still look for ways to mitigate risks in reasonable ways where possible, while we take a least restrictive approach to the person's autonomy. And we're always including that caregiver or the caregiver's perspective or their stresses and what they're having to do in their life as well. It's not only applied to getting up and walking around, and we don't assume that all older adults value and want to live with risk. So some older adults actually prioritize safety, and they don't mind being sort of bubble wrapped or having others make decisions for them if that's how they've always been. And sometimes they may benefit from another way by giving up that autonomy, and that's okay. Okay. So some of the challenges as to why it's hard to implement the dignity of risk are these 4 things here. We're going to unpack a little bit more. So ageism is one thing that keeps us from seeing older adults as able or have the right to try or to look for creative ways to support older adults with activities that we deem risky, because we often see older adults as not capable or less than. Another thing that is challenging is that when we view older adults as needing to be protected or way too vulnerable, and we want to bubble wrap them to keep anything possibly bad from happening to them. And you can imagine that can have detrimental effects on the older adult. And we live in a society, and often our healthcare systems can be very focused on safety. Now, there's some good reasons for that. However, we'll explore the problem with focusing on keeping people safe and how that can have detrimental effects on the older adult with autonomy. And then, of course, the balance is always how do we still support a caregiver while they're providing an extreme amount of care and they have their own things on their plate to be able to uphold autonomy of that older adult. The dignity of risk is only as good as how much we can support our caregivers to identify and uphold these principles. It's easy for us to say, well, what does the older adult want? How can we do what they want? But we really have to know how to coach our caregivers to incorporate the dignity of risk into the care they're already providing. Has anyone read this book, Being Mortal and What Matters in the End? There's a lovely quote that says, "We want autonomy for ourselves, but safety for those we love." And this is an easy thing to do. We all say, "Oh, of course, I really want to stay independent, and I don't want to go to a nursing home." But then, and that comes from a very sort of autonomous lens, and not imagining ourselves with disability or dementia or frailty. But when it comes to being a caregiver, we then quickly transition to, my job is to keep them safe. And by doing that, we forget about the importance of upholding the autonomy and the choice and the sense of self in that process. So ageism is a form of social prejudice, and it's the most tolerated form of social prejudice when compared to other forms of discrimination. So it's prevalent and it's very tolerated. So every one of us do it, sometimes without realizing it, and it can be integrated in sort of different levels, the way that you might experience it. And some of you actually may have experienced it before. I wish we had time to talk about it, to hear your experiences. But it can have negative effects on the physical health and well-being of older adults, especially if we internalize ageism. So if we view aging as bad, to be avoided, something that not to look forward to, that's going to take a toll on our health more than if we view aging as a positive part of life. And we're more likely to take care of ourselves or to reduce our risk of developing frailty if we have a positive perspective of aging. One of the biggest things that we hear a lot is the statement, she's very frail and can't live alone anymore. How could that be ageist? It's a bias. Yep. And we see that word again, very frail. So it's a very subjective word that leads us to believe that, oh my gosh, things must be really bad. It takes away their options. Yes, level of frailty. So we oftentimes hear these sweeping generalizations about older people. They're very frail and they can't. They're very frail and they shouldn't. They have dementia, they can't. And so that's part of the problem in what we're perpetuating as aging is a bad thing. we're not looking at the person in terms of their changing abilities, their remaining strengths, and what they can still be supported to do. We'll move on to this quick exercise. So what may our ageist beliefs and attitudes say about this woman in her kitchen? Yes, that term. We've done this exercise across the province with many, many people, and these are the things: cluttered, disorganized, that she must have a mental illness. Yeah, hazards. Disaster waiting to happen. There's the catastrophizing. Losing skills. Interesting. So we're going to switch the photo. She shouldn't be living like this. Does her perspective change when it's a younger woman? Unorganized, lazy, well, yes, oh, messy. So it's interesting. We're going to go back to the needs to learn, no, just disorganized. We're going to go back to the first photo for a sec, because I think this exercise is quite powerful. When we typically see an older adult in a situation like this, we jump to safety-oriented concerns or assumptions about an older adult not managing. She's at risk. She's not safe. She shouldn't be doing it. She needs help. And that's part of that ageist bias that we have. Now, certainly, if we know that this woman has moderate stage dementia, she's left the burner on twice in the past week, and she's had 3 falls in the past month, that certainly changes our perspective because we have the evidence. But on first glance, we have to be careful how we view people based on their surroundings and how they look. Some may argue that she's actually being quite resourceful. She has things within reach. Maybe it's easier for her to have things on the floor. Maybe that's the way she's always done it. For some reason, she has this setup, so it makes sense to her, and it's meaningful to her. Whereas when we turn to the younger woman, we're much more likely to think, oh, she's probably busy learning how to cook, and we're much more accepting of the disorganized or how we perceive the disorganized environment. So just to be aware of how powerful our unconscious ageism biases can be. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So similar, related to ageism, is when we become overprotective of older adults. And this is when we really jump in and take control of their care. We want to bubble wrap them, and we jump in too soon, and we actually create dependence. Now, certainly I do want to say, if people are living with higher levels of frailty, if they are a level 7 or 8, it is normal to be more protective and more paternalistic. What we're trying to do is understand that, or help people understand that if you're living with a CFS 4, 5, or early 6, we need to be careful not to be too overprotective, because we could be inducing dependence if we're doing that at the lower levels of frailty. Yes, it's nerve-wracking. My mom will fall again, but I know how important walking is to her. It always has been, and now it's the only thing she can still do independently. I do not want to bubble wrap her. And I really like how you frame that, because it feels hard as a caregiver to implement the dignity of risk. But I like how you've outlined the benefits of her walking. You haven't just focused on she may fall again. You've actually focused on the benefits of her walking, what it means to her. And that helps with the coping of knowing that that's still the right thing to do to support. And then sometimes it doesn't take away the stress and the anxiety and the uncertainty, but you've certainly supported your mom to continue doing something that's meaningful, that's within reason. So we're not going to have time for that question. We're going to move on to the next one. That's fine. You guys are getting it. I can't. If you're long distance, it's hard to bubble wrap. The third one is, it's a hyperfocus on safety. So this is when we hear things and we're surrounded by these messages that, not safe to get up, not safe to be home alone, not safe to be home anymore. We must keep them safe, needs 24-hour care. They could fall and hurt themselves. So these messages are surrounding us, and they're often more so in institutional care like hospitals or long-term care. But if we go to the next point, what's the potential? Yeah, just click through. What's unhelpful about using safe, unsafe, that kind of language? Yeah, it can be very fear-inducing. There's a lot of things between safe and unsafe. Sometimes I feel we don't only do things necessarily as protection, but as a caregiver time. Yes, good point, Narissa. Thank you. Which is not always the best way. And we do want to empathize and emphasize that the dignity of risk is difficult to implement all the time. Because of course, if you're in a rush, if you're having a bad day, or just it's not happening today, then certainly do what you have to do. And sometimes you do have to jump in. But it's something to be thinking about where we can implement it. Safe and safety makes black and white. It makes caregivers feel guilty if they can't keep people safe. And so first and foremost, it creates a standard for older adults to try to live up to, but it's a subjective standard. What does safe mean? What does unsafe mean? And it usually removes autonomy or values or preferences. And then it can also make a caregiver feel like, well, if you're telling me mom's not safe to be home, does that mean I have to be there 24/7? And I don't know if I can do that. So, so it does create that black and white thinking rather than risk on a spectrum, and supporting caregivers to unpack the risks and look for ways to mitigate risks and support autonomy. Both feel scared or not to do certain things. Yeah. So just be mindful and aware of how much that language pops up in our culture and society when talking about older adults. The reality is, when we're working with older adults living with frailty and dementia, the risk-free option simply doesn't exist. And I know as a healthcare provider, this made me feel like, oh, okay, so I'm not responsible to keep people 100% safe, because really it's not possible. We're giving ourselves a false sense of security if we only prioritize those one-sided risks. And the one-sided risks tend to be falls and injury, which is really narrow-sighted and doesn't look at the big picture. Also the guilt if you're not able to help. Yeah. So know that when you're working with people with dementia, you're juggling risks, you're chasing risks. And so it's unrealistic to look for the risk-free option. So then we shift to risk mitigation. So then we want to aim to mitigate, not eliminate. And this opens up conversations, it opens up problem solving, it opens up looking at the risk as a real thing rather than a all or nothing, oh, they're not safe, they can't do it. I do want to say, actually, I'll say it later. This is fine. So this is one of my favorite resources from the UK. If you're keen to look at a resource, Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gained, Risk Guidance for People with Dementia. So one of the very first steps in risk assessment, and we had a previous point in the chat about this, is balancing the positive benefit of taking the risk. So there is a benefit of taking the risk. What is it? And then weighing that against the negative effect of attempting to avoid risk altogether. So already you start to have a more balanced conversation about what it is the older adult wants to do or would be helpful to do. And then you're not focused on so much about, oh my gosh, they're going to fall down the stairs and break their neck, and without looking at the bigger picture. So one of my favorite examples is the risk of getting lost if a person with dementia goes out unaccompanied needs to be set against the possible risks of boredom and frustration from remaining inside. So there's a good starting point when we're talking about our concerns or worries with older adults living with dementia. That would be a hard one. I know. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And so that one's a good example. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Risk of leaving someone with dementia in the home, or is it time to get them out? Yeah. And I should say this is a very individualistic process and context dependent. But we'll go through basic steps you can apply to your own situation so that you can be thinking about, okay, is this risk worth supporting for the benefits, or is today the day that we have to be a little bit restrictive? Today's the day we can actually go a little bit more with autonomy, and you can learn to do that balance. This is another great resource it's more for healthcare providers or for anyone who's interested in more of the evidence and the higher level stuff. But it gives people the language and the steps for a risk management approach to care planning, so that we don't overestimate risk and that we don't jump to an overly protective approach. And so I would highly recommend even the Caregiver Nova Scotia staff to take a look at this resource and take the e-learning module. It's really helpful. Okay, so here are last few slides. A quick guide to risk assessment and management. So when you're thinking about your older adults and your levels of frailty, you have that initial risk level, whether they're a 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8. That's going to give you a different picture depending on the level of frailty. But you're going to name the concern. So what is the concern? And avoid labeling it good or bad at first. So in my experience, sometimes the concern is, well, mom gets the mail every day at the mailbox, or dad's walking to the park, or the toileting alone at night, or using the stove. So all of those can be concerns, but we haven't yet labeled them good or bad. Next, highlight the value or the benefit of the concern. So before you jump to naming the risks, consider why these activities or these things are good for that person. And it's usually around a routine, a value, a preference, getting up and walking around, sense of well-being, social benefits, or a cultural meaning for them to do the concern or the activity. And then we do have to name the negative risks or the negative outcomes. They could fall, they could become lost, or have experience incontinence, or leaving the stove on. So so if we move on to the next step, we get to assessing the level of risk. So this is a really important stage because this is where we tend to catastrophize the worst case scenario, and we jump to the severity of the outcome. We don't want to miss the first two steps there: highlight the value benefit of the concern and name the risks. And we don't want to miss the step of assessing the likelihood. So let's say someone is going to go get the mail and you're worried about them becoming lost. However, your situation or your evidence is telling you that actually they do get the mail 2 times a week, or they check the mail 2 times a week. They have not become lost. They return home every time. Then the likelihood of becoming lost while going to check the mail in broad daylight or whatever the pattern is going to be unlikely, or maybe a medium risk. So your likelihood is going to depend on the contextual information. You don't want to use your what ifs, because that will lead, or what ifs lead us to think that the worst case scenario is going to happen every single time. And that tends to restrict the older adult. And then target your care plan to mitigate the risks rather than eliminate activity altogether. Now, the one exception here I would say is that, of course, if safety to others is in the picture, then you're probably going to jump to a more restrictive approach. And driving, if someone's still driving at moderate stage dementia, you're probably not going to spend weeks to months trying to mitigate risks. You're probably going to be looking for ways to eliminate the activity because of the safety to others. Okay, and then we'll go to the next slide. So common concerns that often come up, and when I worked as an OT, these were the concerns that I would get a whole list of, or an email or a phone call about from caregivers. And so we want to actually be careful not to get overwhelmed by these concerns, and look at them in ways to help us to prioritize which ones are the real risks that we should look at versus which ones are the ones we could probably let go a little bit longer and not intervene in a way that's going to restrict the person. Which one stands out as something that you might say, you know what, it's a noted change in the person, but we could probably let that go, not a big deal, doesn't pose a whole lot of risk? Is there one or two there? For some people, it might be smoking. Yeah. Again, it's going to depend on the person's cognitive level and memory level and what's been happening or what's already happened. The rotten food. Yeah. So certainly that's sometimes a change to note in their ability to have judgment around food, but we're not going to overly restrict someone because they have some rotten food in the fridge, not letting home care staff in. The ones that we're probably going to prioritize a little bit sooner, yes, is the driving, because we have the safety to others, especially, again, if they're in closer to moderate stages of dementia. Won't bathe and doesn't want help. Yeah, and so sometimes we may think, well, what are the risks of not bathing for that person for this long? Are the risks worth jumping in to intervene in an overly restrictive way? And sometimes not. Okay, we're going to try to wrap up so we can have a little bit of discussion. So a quick example, let's say you're working with someone with mild dementia, mild to moderate frailty level, CFS 5 to 6, 5 creeping into 6. The concern is walking outside alone. So we're going to talk about the value of the benefit to that person in the situation. Could be exercise, social, brain stimulation, routine, emotional relief. And then the risks, or the possible risks, are becoming lost, being taken advantage of or scammed, having a fall, and the cold weather. So notice in my possible risks, I did not talk about the possible consequences from that, not yet. So the risk assessment is how likely are the risks to happen? And again, it's going to depend on that situation. But use real information, not generalizing that they have dementia, the worst case scenario is going to happen. And then how severe will the consequences be if the risk did happen? So if the person does become lost, we know if they have dementia, then we do have to be concerned because the risk of not being found or death increases higher. So then that actually gives us a cue of what we might be able to do to mitigate the risk. And so we go to mitigating the risks while optimizing autonomy. So that will give you your problem solving and your interventions that you can try with a person, like the GPS locator. Again, it depends on the situation, but having only one coat at the front door is a choice, making sure neighbors are aware. I worked with one man that we had a record of his walks, and they were pretty consistent. He would always turn left. He would never cross the street. Around a few blocks, he would go and visit a friend. The friend would call the caregiver and say, he's arrived. I'll let you know when he leaves. And so there were checkpoints in place to mitigate the risk while still continuing to support him with that meaningful activity. Okay, we're going to wrap up with the key points. So the key points with frailty and the dignity of risk are that understanding the frailty level helps predict how best to support autonomy and where help is truly needed. So don't be afraid to look at the frailty level, and even within that, moderate frailty has a wide range. So it can depend on how many ADLs a person needs help with and to what degree they need help with. Remember that risk can lead to positive outcomes that are meaningful to the older adult, and not to override that quickly. Yes, and Project Lifesaver is another one that can be helpful. I don't know if Project Lifesaver, the last time I've heard that their gadgets are quite bulky, whereas something like an AirTag or an Apple Watch is a little bit more, I would say, person-centered in that it can blend in with your outfit a little bit more. We know we're working with risk. We can't work against it, because if we work against it, we're probably going to become overprotective and overestimate risk pretty quickly. And know when that safety language, that black and white safety language, might be unhelpful. Try to avoid the what ifs. I know this is hard, and the catastrophizing. So use your real contextual information in your risk assessment. What are the real facts from that person in their routine and what's really happening? So whenever possible, aim to mitigate risk, not eliminate. And there will be uncertainty. Be kind to yourself and other caregivers juggling, again, many ever-evolving risk. Yes, and so a tag with the phone number attached, in addition to a tag. Yeah, I highly recommend, and there's a lot of research, a lot of interesting research actually in Canada as well, that's looking at assistive technology and AI technology to mitigate risk while supporting autonomy. One of the things they're looking at is creating an insole for a shoe. So the insole, the shoe, actually has GPS locating, and it has data receptors that capture things like balance, gait speed, weight shifting, and weight bearing. So I think the future of supporting older adults and caregivers in the future, or at home with dementia, is going to be a lot of smart technology and AI driven. Okay, we are happy to stay for a few minutes for questions and comments and discussion. It's a big topic, and we know that it can be a difficult topic for some and can be uncomfortable. So we're happy to stay for a little bit of a chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much. I've really struggled. My mom is, stage 7, late stages dementia in a nursing home. She's had 4 falls in the last 6 months, the last 2 being very serious, one caused by a seizure. And I've had friends say, put her in a wheelchair, put her in a wheelchair, but I really, really struggled with it. She always told me she didn't want to be kept alive for the sake of being kept alive. So and my gut told me just let her walk even if she falls. And so I just felt guilty when she fell again, but I know in the 2 months in between the falls, it regulated her. It kept her legs strong and her muscles from atrophying. And if they put her in a wheelchair, she would probably have to be tranquilized because she would be so agitated, and then she really wouldn't have any quality of life. So I just want to say thank you so much for affirming my thought process, and that, safety isn't always the best, or complete safety isn't always the best way to go.
Thank you, Andrea. I think your story and your experience could probably help inform a lot of our society and approach to older adult care. And we would 100% agree with you that there's a general lack of understanding the risk of restraining or risks of keeping someone in a seated position. And so so certainly we've prevented them from standing and moving and falling, but only at the risk of all these other things. And does that match the values and preferences of that person? And have we introduced new risks like responsive behaviors that then often lead to antipsychotics and other things? So Andrew, I think your story is a very important one, and I think we should be talking more with that balanced approach and acknowledging how hard that is as a caregiver, that feeling of like, is this the right thing to do? And not feeling bad about saying to your friends, family, neighbors, you know what, this is a decision that I'm doing my best with, and there are risks the other way too. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I did want to say that I have done what I can to mitigate, and I know this is what she would want. And so she does wear hip protectors. I've got her something called a rib cap that has some protective things around the head. Unfortunately, she always falls forward, but if she ever fell backwards, it would help. I got her new shoes with good soles, so I've done my best to mitigate the damage if and she will fall again. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Sometimes we can't prevent the fall, but we can do things to mitigate the risk of injury and severity of injury.
I think the biggest thing is, even if it's not real in the moment right now, it is real to that person.
Yes.
So I think validating that it's a real feeling to that person is the most important. We always use the example of, if I lost my purse, I'm going around losing my purse. In my mind, that's my real problem. I lost my purse. Maybe I didn't have my purse to begin with, but in my head, I've had my purse and I lost it. And then someone comes up to me and was like, oh no, you didn't lose your purse. You'll find it. Don't worry about it. You're not validating my feelings that I'm fearful that I just lost my purse. And now I'm trying to redirect or direct the situation, but I'm still having those real feelings, and it may not be real to everybody else, but it's real to me. So I think the biggest situation when someone has a memory or a feeling that isn't real to the situation, it is true to them. So validating how scary that would be. And then using, after validation, you can use some methods of redirection, but before you redirect, you really have to validate the feelings, if that helps.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. You may find it helpful too if the Caregivers Nova Scotia or the Alzheimer's Society has an info line for exactly these types of questions. It's such a good question. So if you feel like you want a little bit more support through that scenario, I would say give a call, and so you can speak to one-on-one with someone. But it's a difficult situation for sure sometimes. I always say it depends, but certainly I support you if that person has the ability to empathize that this may be difficult for you. Absolutely say, you know what, this is what this means for me when this happens, and I can't do this anymore. I actually think that's a very healthy way to communicate your needs as a caregiver, if that person's able to understand. If they're not, you're just trying to reason with someone who doesn't have reasoning abilities. So the next step with that situation, because ultimately, in my mind, based on what you're just telling me, you did the right thing, because the risk of keeping that cat, continuing infections, continuing this rigmarole, is that she would be more likely to have to be admitted to hospital, less likely to return home. Just went right where I wanted you to go. And that's perfect. So then you've met everyone's needs in a way that's still optimizing autonomy and feelings of comfort. Good for you. Okay, so you figured it out. Yeah, and so that brings up the concept of taking a least restrictive approach first. And this is where everything is so different, because it's, do I remove the cat right away, or do I look at another option that's kind of in between, i.e., try a foster cat, or do I jump to the mechanical cat? It's the same thing as stove safety. Do I remove the stove altogether, or do I just try removing 2 of the burners rather than unplug the fuse? If the person doesn't mind, I'll unplug the fuse. Home care comes in and cooks. So it really depends on how upset the person's going to be if that thing is removed. If they're not upset, remove it. And at the end of the day, if you're still supporting that person to be at home where they want to be, if they want to be there and it brings them meaning, like that's typically the end game, isn't it? So sometimes we have to make these tiny little overly restrictive compromises in the meantime to keep them there. So ways to mitigate risk with driving, because we know driving again poses safety to others. So when I worked in a geriatric clinic, myself and geriatricians and nurses would think of ways of how to reduce the risk. How do we look for just daytime driving within a certain radius that tends to be familiar? No highway driving if possible. Having, again, GPS locator to know where they are in case you have to get to them as soon as you can. Making sure that where are they driving? Do they have to be driving every day, or can we reduce the frequency of driving? Anytime you can reduce the frequency of a risky activity, you're reducing the risk. And then so building parameters around that, and then eventually, if they do have to give up driving, how do you taper that where you gradually take over that where someone else is driving for them? Are they still in the passenger seat and they can still point out where to go? They can be the backseat driver in the passenger seat. So looking for ways to mitigate the risks if they are still driving and they're still capable of driving would include those parameters that you would try to implement into their routine. You want to be clear that if people are living with dementia, driving should be intervened at one point, especially in the later mild stages to moderate stages. The other thing too is if you want to have a driving assessment via an OT rehab setting, there are adaptations you can make to cars for physical disabilities. And so that can help people support driving for longer time if their disability is physical related. And so at that point, and I would recommend, if you're not already, to drive with them every now and again to see what that reaction time is like. Because certainly if it's not quick enough and there are situations happening that are concerning, that might be a conversation to have with the physician to see what would that look like. The doctor can help with the driving issue. But then again, like you're thinking about, if we remove the license, does that mean that we're now isolated? Or what things does the person not be able to get? But I'm supportive of taking a little bit more of a restrictive approach with driving, especially in dementia when there are there's safety issues to others.
It is used widely across the world. The UK, Australia use it. They're more ahead than we are. We are incorporated the CFS scores in acute care in the hospitals within Nova Scotia. And we're currently looking at how we're implementing it within primary care. So we're in the early phases of implementation in primary care. But that's our next step.
I highly encourage for people to do their self-score so that if you ever walk into your physician's office and you're over the age of 65, you want to be able to say, my clinical frailty scale score is a 2, a 3, a 4, and I want to stay here as long as possible. And ideally, primary care would be equipped with frailty identification and management as well. So don't be afraid to bring your own CFS score with you with all your health interactions. Thank you. This is always a great topic to have lots of good conversations. It's not black and white, lots of gray zones, and Courtney and I are happy to join you today. Thank you for the invite, Emily.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you both so much for the fantastic and engaging presentation. On behalf of all of us here in the audience and at Caregivers Nova Scotia, we really appreciate your time and your information. And thank you to everybody who participated today. I hope you all have a great day. Thanks.